Hi, I'm Paul Wagenseal. I'm a custom content strategist with Cyber Risk Alliance, and I'm here with Chris Simmons, who's a VP of Marketing and Strategy. I'm sorry I messed that up. at Savvy. VP of Strategy at Savvy. And our topic is called, is your SSO on point, or is it more like single sign oh no? So Chris, tell me a little bit about Savvy.
Thanks. So Savvy is an identity-first SaaS security company. Our solution is designed with, the reality that identities are essentially the front door to any SaaS app. And so, considering that identity and SaaS security are inseparable, we focus on finding and fixing the gaps in a company's existing IAM infrastructure and look for blind spots and ensure efficacy. And so how we do that is through a combination of discovery techniques, but people have invested in SSO, IDPs, IGA, PAM, all of the technologies, and yet they're still suffering with account-related takeovers, with breaches that can be traced back to compromised credentials and things like that. And so with SaaS, it's never more apparent that there is a need to really have really strong identity security.
So how do you fill those gaps? How do you solve those problems?
Yeah, so the way that Savvy does it is we first do discovery, because again, visibility is probably one of the hardest challenges that companies face, is really just knowing what do I have and who has access to it. Some very basic questions that are really difficult to answer whenever it comes to SaaS world. 53% of most SaaS apps today are adopted and put into use without involving the IT department at all anymore. So getting that visibility is really hard. And so how we do it is we deploy on the IDP, we deploy on the email server, as well as in the browser. And by looking at the different layers of that, we're able to discover what is supposed to happen and what is actually happening, right? And so we can discover things like when an application has been onboarded to SSO and you think, okay, job's done. Everybody's using SSO, right? Not quite, right? The actual utilization is far lower is what we have found. And so by being in the browser, we can compare against what's supposed to be the policy in the IDP, and then report on where those gaps are. And that's whenever I say we identify IAM gaps, that's how we do it.
Yeah, so you do it in the browser, right? That makes sense. And it's interesting, you're bringing up all this, I wouldn't call it, maybe you can call it shadow SaaS. People, installing things, implementing things without really telling the IT department.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, and we used to call it shadow IT, shadow SaaS, and now it's commonly just being called business-led IT because that's the way it's happening, right? It's the reality. This democratized IT model is well underway.
Right.
Adopting SaaS was the first step, and then when we went through the pandemic, people kind of hit the gas really hard on this decentralized model.
Of course.
And now we see CIOs, CISOs federating their responsibilities with the business leaders in the organization. And so this gives them a model of being able to do that, but still have some visibility and governance over the ecosystem.
That's interesting. I mean, so this is, you're actually kind of fulfilling a need that many people may not be aware they have.
Absolutely. Yeah, the biggest challenge that we have is people have a very high false sense of security. They just believe my users would never do that. Like, for example, we have this was discovered during a merger and acquisition due diligence period where we were deployed, and we found that one account had been using a AI note taker. They had connected it with an identity that they created, but then shared that same password was also their Facebook password, their Gmail password, and several other personal accounts. And not only that, it had been compromised. And so, and this was unmanaged app, shared, compromised, and whenever we see things like that, separately, they're not that big of a deal. They're a big deal, but you have to prioritize.
Right.
But we call those toxic risks whenever you see the combination of shared, reused, compromised credentials, and then with a very highly sensitive app, especially during mergers and acquisitions, an AI note taker, what could happen?
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. I mean it's you know you may have a bunch of small things that don't look dangerous isolated, but when you chain them together, then you just create a huge risk.
Absolutely.
That's really interesting.
And businesses today are just really blind to this. They're not able to really get a good grip on the visibility of what's happening outside the known. Yeah, companies have done such a great job with implementing single sign-on for their core applications, but like the AI note taker is a great example, or something like a Notion or a project management tool like Asana. People use those apps without telling the IT department.
And it sounds great, but I mean, the AI note taker is a great example, because I mean, someone I work with suddenly started putting this in all our meetings, and it sounds great, but then you realize that is a machine identity. That is a person in the chat, you know, and that machine identity has its own identity and must be managed as well.
Yeah, and we commonly see that people use use their own personal identities to connect and link apps. Like take a Salesforce linking to any number of helper apps like that may be used. You actually use your own personal identity to make that connection. And so we discover that we call those app-to-app identities as well.
Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, you want to get something done, you use a lousy password. I'm going to go change it, make a better password later. You never do.
Right.
You know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, like whenever people have they onboard an app into their central management system, how often do they go back and remove all access to direct logins? And so what we're able to show, right, is we're saying, okay, 43% of this app that you thought you had onboarded to your SSO, people are still logging in directly because that's the way they've always done it. And they were never really instructed to do anything different. And then you have things like break glass accounts and other legitimate reasons. And so one of the great things about Savvy is that we can interact with the user inside the browser and say, hey, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Is this personal? Are you are you trying to do you know that this account has been onboarded to our SSO? Can I take you there and log in this way instead? And so we can kind of enforce or encourage good identity hygiene behaviors.
Okay. Now, how would you get everyone to jump on board SSO? How would you force them to change their ways?
So whenever we detect a login page, we're actually able to frost over the page and block it, and so that they can't log in with that. And so we don't need to configure the app in any way, because we can just simply block the login.
Okay, that's great.
And redirect them to the single sign-on.
Okay. So what leads to a false sense of security when people are using SSO?
Yeah, it's really like I mentioned earlier, you know, they think, oh, I've onboarded this, my job's done. We talk to a number of people in the IAM space, and we say, you know, how do you validate that this is what's actually happening? How sure are you that your SSO is working the way that you intended? And until you ask them, a lot of times people just haven't really thought about it, or they've thought about it but just didn't realize that there's a way that they could solve the issue and actually put some checks and balances in place.
I think it's also because most people will, you know, they want to turn it on and forget, you know, set it and forget it.
Absolutely. Everybody wants the easy button, and this is really a way of eliminating a lot of the manual labor. Like you know, you get something like the mother of all breaches that happened, you know, was it earlier this year, late last year? And you know, you do a search and find all these accounts that you may have been involved with, or your user base may have been involved with, right? And said, you know, instead of calling all those up and walking them through a process, you know, you can just build an automation playbook to say, hey, we need you to reset this password, this password, this password, and we're going to walk you through that process in the browser.
Okay, that sounds like a good way to handle it.
So it saves time.
So we've gone over this a bit, but why is good identity hygiene? Why is it really, really crucial for SaaS security?
Yeah, and you know, identity, as I mentioned earlier, it's the front door to every SaaS app, and it is, you know, it's not the only thing about good SaaS security, but it's the fundamental thing that you need to get right. And unfortunately, we see really bad identity hygiene.
Yeah.
And when you know, there's so many notable breaches. I don't want to call anyone out here today, but you know, everyone knows that there's been some really high-profile breaches recently, where you know, account takeover, compromised credentials. Yeah. You know, all of these things that were preventable. There was a recent government breach where the person used they had admin level privileges on a remote access server, and they were able to then, the account was compromised, no MFA enabled. Again, we see that as a toxic combination of risk. That's something you should not, you know, let linger. But without the tools to really get visibility to it and then do something about it, it's a tough problem.
I think if someone's been in the position for more than 5 years, it's a pretty safe bet there's no MFA enabled.
Right.
You know, that's something you really have to go back and investigate in a way. Do you have tools that could do that? That could find out whether or not, you know, Joe Admin, who's been on the job since 2015, does he have MFA enabled on his account or not?
Exactly. Yeah. So we're able to validate whether the MFA is enabled, and then we can provide ongoing and continuous monitoring to make sure it stays enabled. Because some apps you can flip it on and off. Right? You can, you know, some apps you can lock it so that it has to be used, where other apps you may be able to bypass it. And there's a number of reasons why, you know, you might not want to only rely on your single sign-on and the MFA that it provides, because, you know, maybe it's really expensive and you don't want to pay the SSO tax, and so you choose not to onboard that app into your central management, identity management solution. And so this is a way that you can still provide that assurance that that hygiene is up to standard for what your policy dictates.
Well, we hear a lot about the SSO tax. I mean, how bad is it really? I mean, you're paying for a service. There's obviously a benefit for it. Why is there resistance to that, to sort of, you know, paying for SSO?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the criticality of the app, and we see it a lot more with this business-led IT that I've mentioned. Sure. Where the person doesn't want to break out a credit card, so they just use the freemium version. And you know, we used to find rogue SaaS usage by auditing the books. You know, what kind of
who paid for what?
Yeah, what kind of expenses are being submitted for software subscriptions, right? But with a lot of freemium apps, there is no such transaction like that, and you can almost guarantee that if it's a freemium version, it doesn't have the SSO enabled, and so.
Okay, so what can organizations do to gain checks and balances for their SSO strategy?
Yeah, you know, like I mentioned, using tools like Savvy, you really need to be able to understand and gain visibility into the entire SaaS footprint, like not just what you've centrally managed. We typically discover 4 times as many SaaS apps in use, active use, than what a company has in their SSO. Wow. And so it's a pretty staggering number. And then you have all kind of additional issues, like offboarding is another one we haven't talked about yet. Sure. You know, movers, joiners, leavers. How do you keep up with all of that? And how do you ensure that whenever someone leaves the organization for an unmanaged SaaS app, that you've removed their identity or you've disabled access to their identity, right? And so offboarding is another really great use case for Savvy, where we're able to we passively discover who the app admin is. So whenever it comes time to offboard, you know who to ask. That's one of the biggest challenges, is knowing who to ask. And so you know, offboarding, we can just automate that whole process and make it much more painless, and allow people to have a much higher degree of overall identity security without so much effort, without the manual effort. Because without a tool like Savvy, you look at the problem and you go, this is too much. Like it's like a big tidal wave, you know, or avalanche, you know, coming at you. The number of apps, there are just too many to be effective at, and it's only growing. I think, you know, we saw the average number of apps inside an organization trend down a little bit from last year, because companies are finally starting to try to get their hands around this SaaS sprawl problem, and reduce the number of apps that are in use at the organization.
They're pruning a little bit.
Yes.
But that's I really think that's only going to be temporary,
Yeah.
isn't it? I mean,
Yeah, well, we had one customer who was trying to migrate off of a project management tool, and they were trying to migrate users that they had been working on the project to go from this tool to that tool. It was taking them 9 months to do this, and as soon as they would move one group of people, some more people would sign up. You know, so it's like this game of whack-a-mole. And so what we were able to do was, by being present there in the browser, is just stop people from signing up and say, hey, this is actually the app that you should be using. Can you just comply with the policy and use this one instead? And we were able to move everybody over in 2 weeks.
Was there any resistance to that when you did that?
No.
Really? Yeah, okay. That's great.
So,
yeah. All right. I believe we are out of time, if that's correct. I think we are. So, once again, we've been talking to Chris Simmons, who's a VP of Strategy at Savvy. And please, you can go back and watch this interview at securityweekly.com/SavvyIDV. That's SAVVYIDV. I'm Paul Wagenseal for Cyber Risk Alliance.